Welcome everyone, Katie Anderson here, and I am so excited to be continuing my author interview series with my longtime friend and colleague, Ken Pilone, who's written an amazing book that I highly recommend called Lean Leadership on a Napkin. And we're here today to talk about the book, some of Ken's insights from his career, both at Toyota and in healthcare, and just catch up in general. Ken and I just had a quick catch up. We hadn't talked in a few years, but for some context, we both worked together at the Sutter healthcare system in California about a decade ago, and were responsible for leading the lean transformation efforts at different parts within the healthcare system there. So Ken, thank you for being here, and I'm really excited to talk with you about your book.
Thank you. So great to see you again, my friend.
Yeah, it's so good. You know, the question I always start off with, and I know you do explore this in the book, which I read last night and really loved, with your writing style and your stories and how simple you make it, which you also talk about. But what inspired you to write the book in the first place? Or what problem were you trying to solve by writing the book?
That's probably the most common question I get. Yeah. I saw the trend in books around lean getting bigger and fatter and more complicated. And I kept scratching my head thinking, why is this so difficult? The way I learned it, when I grew up in Toyota with this, it was a simple common sense approach. And so I wanted to go the other direction. In fact, if I could have done it in a comic book, I would have. The idea being to keep it simple and straightforward, and going back to what my understanding was about it, which is a pretty fundamental set of principles and tools.
Yeah, and that comes through in your book too, that let's get back to the simplicity of it. And we've overcomplicated lean and the tools and the systems and structures so much that it almost, like, people are like, oh, I don't want that. But I love, you have a good quote in here that it's applied common sense. And that's so true.
Yeah, that's what I've reduced it down to after almost 40 years. It's just 3 words.
Applied common sense. You know, I forgot to ask you before we got started to share just a little bit of your background and history of how you came to have so much wisdom that you were able to distill down into that applied common sense.
Oh, well, it's been a long career. And again, I apologize, I got a frog in my throat today. I started out in multiple industries in manufacturing and aerospace and so on. And then I ended up at Toyota, starting out in training and development as the head of training development at the company headquarters. About halfway through my 20-year career there, I got asked to join a team of 5 other people to create the University of Toyota. And the University of Toyota was intended to consolidate all the training and education. And so in that mode, I was forced to learn about it and try to figure out what made sense for us to teach. How do we teach it? How is white collar environment different than manufacturing? And so I was immersed in it up to my nose. And that brought me to Toyota in Japan, and spent time in the archives there and learning about the history, which just hooked me. So I got so enthralled with the whole process. But then as I started seeing what others were doing, as I mentioned earlier, everything seemed like it was getting so complicated. And I thought, well, I must have missed something. So my book there then is really to just sort of try to take the essence, the nugget, and make that available to people in a simple way. Now, if they want more, there's a lot more out there. But this is really intended for people just learning at the beginning stages of their career, particularly leaders. What is this thing? What is this lean thing? And my experience with executives is they want things pretty simple.
Yeah, and enjoyable to read. As I mentioned, that really came through, and even I, as a more seasoned lean practitioner, really enjoyed the book because you distill it down to the essence, and you write it to have talking points too. So you give a little history of Toyota and how it came to be, and you have this glossary in there with some of the key terms, and then you talk about some of the key steps that people need to take to really start learning and practicing this. But it was super engaging and actually a bit of a roadmap for lean consultants and internal coaches to be thinking about how they lead their transformation as well.
Well, thank you for that. One thing I think that's different about me in this world of lean is I also bring an OD background, an OD perspective. And so what's unique, I think, about this and the lens I look at this through is a combination of lean stuff and OD stuff around cultural transformation. So I bring both of those things together and braided them together in a way that I think is not focused strictly on lean, but it's supposed to be on what does the whole organization look like? How do you transform, period? If lean is a direction, it's one thing, but how does one approach a organizational transformation from A to B? How do you do that?
Yes, and I thought that was really great. I love with the I3 approach that you developed at the University of Toyota, and you describe here in this book of introduction, integration, and internalization. And this book is really focused on that phase 1 introduction. And you mentioned that this is like the most risky phase, and that people tend to, if like a transformation is going to fail, this is where it often happens. So, perhaps you could share with us sort of what are some of those, like the few top things that you see people getting wrong, and one suggestion you have for people getting started on a transformation to avoid these risks.
Well, one of the things, as you correctly pointed out, and you've seen yourself in your career, many, if not most, transformations fail, whether it's lean or anything else. They just fail. And part of it is, I think, is they underestimate the resistance. They think it's a really cool thing. Everybody should jump on board, and everybody doesn't. Everybody won't. People are naturally cynical or have learned to become cynical, or they've seen the flavor of the month come and go. So one piece of advice is don't underestimate the negative resistance. You're not going to see it until you start moving. But as soon as you start moving, you're going to encounter that drag, those headwinds. But that you have to be realistic, but persistent. The other half of that is start small. I try to emphasize, instead of going after or trying to tackle the entire transformation all at once, particularly in a large organization, try a model cell, try a department, and be upfront about it. Hey, we're going to experiment, because you and I both know that if you experiment in the right way in a model cell, it's going to work, and then it's going to start to spread. Yeah. So start small. Don't underestimate the resistance.
Yeah, and I always like to thank you. I appreciate that. I always like to think that really starting from a human side, what are those elements that are sort of causing people to present with resistance, and how do we help bring them along on that change as well? Because we all have that experience, right, of something's happening to us and we don't want it. So how can we help them along on that?
Yeah.
In addition, one of the things that also came clear in your book too, that part of that introduction is also getting the executive team to understand what this is. It's not just something you're delegating. So definitely starting with a model cell to do a learning lab, but as your book really is focusing on, like, what are those key elements of learning that need to happen from the executive team about what this is all about as well?
I think that what I would say, it goes back to, they need to start by learning about themselves. And really understand what is your MO. How do you present as a leader currently? How do the leadership team present themselves? What do you believe is right about your leadership? And so I think a credible consultant would spend a lot of time with leaders, getting them to reflect. The whole notion of Hanse. It's like, who am I? What do I believe as a leader? What am I willing to give up? I'm inspired by the leaders who really turned themselves sort of inside out, almost to the point where they at first didn't recognize themselves. It was a very risky place to be. They're out of their comfort zone because they're letting go of things that got them where they are.
Yeah.
Letting go of the command and control and power and structure and, being the boss.
Yeah.
And that's not easy to let go of.
That's so true. I mean, that's even been my own experience. Not that I met when I was in a leadership role, not even aware how much I was leading from a command and control standpoint, even though I knew all this about lean leadership. And so we have to have the humility to look at ourselves and our opportunities to improve as well. And that can feel risky to see, especially senior executives who have, been rewarded and had career success because of how they, and showed up in the past. I had the incredible opportunity this year to be on stage with the CEO of General Electric, Larry Culp, to talk about his own leadership learning journey and also leading with lean. And he also loved my book, which was super amazing. So I'm excited for you to read it as well, Learning to Lead, Leading to Learn. And I asked him a question too, like what did he have to shift in himself? And he said it was asking more questions and listening and basically unlearning what he had learned at business school about what leadership was all about. So
yeah. Unlearning is really the key word, isn't it?
Yeah.
I have given up trying to get executives to think their way into this new way of leading. And I replaced that notion, which fails miserably, but to ask them what they thought their legacy was at that moment. How would people describe you as a leader? And is that what you want? And with that line of questioning, it's like, how would you like people that have worked for you, under you, around you, to describe you at some point in the future? And boy, that tends to really open up for people, because they hear themselves articulate that I want to be able to inspire people, grow people, lead people by example, be a servant, all that kind of stuff. And then they automatically find themselves, oh my gosh, that's not what I'm doing. I'm not doing that at all. And that creates some of that tension that maybe I do need to make a little bit of a turn. And the other thing that I found useful in getting leaders to kind of think about this is say, how do you raise your children? Do you want them to be dependent on you? Do you want to always answer the questions for them and make their decisions for them for the rest of their lives? I mean, how do you get them to where they become independent, fully functioning adults as a parent? And so that parallel often gets them to thinking. And then they create in their own mind a vision of themselves in the future. Then I just provide them with some nudging along the way.
Yeah, that's so connected to what I was sharing with you earlier about this idea of intention and how I talk about it coming from the Japanese symbols, meaning heart and direction. It's like, what impact do you want to have and who do you want to be? And then are your actions and how you're showing up really aligned with creating that impact? And I see the biggest gap, not for leaders not having the heart or not having the desired impact or that legacy, but really not realizing that some of their habits and actions are really having the opposite impact. And so how can they make that shift? You talked earlier about, leaders learning by doing as well. And I was really struck by one of the comments in your book that you said, if there's one thing to do to transform your organization, it's to use and practice A3 thinking. And this was actually a comment that James Hereford, who was the executive I was reporting to at the Palo Alto Medical Foundation, the part of Sutter that I was leading, believed as well, that A3 thinking and working on strategic A3s was the way to get the executives to have to practice the same sort of mindset and thinking and behaviors that we were asking others to do too. So I'm curious for you, why do you believe that A3 thinking and using A3s is the one thing, if you're only going to do one thing, to do?
Well, as you well know, it's a scientific method on paper. And it starts with a hypothesis, and I think I like the idea that it forces you to think logically. Now, there's some people that comes naturally, I'll be honest. And some people sort of systematically thinking about things and they go about things in a logical, sequential way. But not all, certainly. I know it helped me personally this way. So by guiding the thinking, the A3 guiding my thinking on to solving a problem, it raises a whole bunch of questions. And by asking those questions, you become more humble. And by becoming more humble, you become a better leader. So it's more than just a piece of paper. It's more than just doing a thorough A3. It's really the enrichment personally that you get from it, the lessons that you've learned, the notion that, hey, it's not over when it's over. You know, you get to the end of the A3, guess what? You can start all over again. This notion of it being a slinky, which also embeds the notion of Kaizen in their mind. So everything good about Lean in a way, I think, could be found within the four corners of the A3.
Yeah. And I agree completely. And I would add too, that it's not just found within the four corners, but also in the interaction that people have about it being a development process as well. And I guess maybe it could be in the four corners because the manager or the boss is stamping his or her Tonko or making the signature that they've signed off on the thinking process. So overseeing it from a coaching perspective as well, which is so integrated into the essence of the process of A3 thinking.
Yeah. You know, I've been thinking lately in A3, while it seems very straightforward, and it is done right, I think it's very simple, very straightforward, but it's also nuanced. But to me, it's in some ways like a Rubik's Cube because every time you do one, it's different.
It's true.
Every time, and even if you're doing a follow-up on one that's already been completed, that's going to be different. And so, and it also helps people break the mold that it's this mechanical, contrived process, and that I did it once, therefore I know how to do it. Yeah. And also, as you pointed out, those sponsors, you ask the sponsors, like, what did you learn from guiding your people through the A3 process? What could you have done differently to help them through that process? What did you learn from this? That to reflect on their own leadership style and their own intention, as you put it out, and to what extent that had an influence on the outcome, as well as the people that were involved in it.
Yeah, that's great. One of in my past experience of having worked in healthcare for decades and also having other, the external, people coming in to be internal coaches and consultants for a lean transformation, having come from manufacturing or other industries, many people from non-healthcare backgrounds sometimes have a hard time making the shift into healthcare. And you've had a really successful second career working in healthcare systems. And I'm curious, for almost a decade and a half, I'm curious, what do you think were some enablers for you to make the transition across very different sort of industries from manufacturing to healthcare?
Yeah, it's a great question. Well, I'd start with the foundation for Lean and the foundation for healthcare, at least in a clinical space, is a scientific method. So there's a common language there. I was in a meeting early on in Hoag Hospital when I first started working there. It was my first healthcare experience, and I was teaching an A3 workshop there. And the CMO of the organization was in the audience. No, I apologize. It was the CEO of Hoag. Was in the audience, which wasn't expected, but he wanted to be a role model, and so he came. And about halfway through the workshop, he asked me during a break if he could speak to the group before we restarted. And I went, I guess so, sure. And I was nervous about it because I didn't know what he was going to say. But what he said was, you know what, guys, this is the first time that I've been exposed to anything that can help bridge the gap between clinical and non-clinical staffs. If we can agree on this, because it's all fact-based and it's scientific, if we could get the non-clinical people to think the way that we think and use this methodology, we could have a much more holistic management leadership approach for the organization. That's code for saying, you guys don't get it. If you understand this A3 thinking, you're going to get it. And so that really gave me a lot of confidence in what I was doing. And I actually got a lot of head nodding from the non-clinical people. Said, yeah, I can see that. This is something that would help us communicate in the same language.
Yeah, that's great. And of course, the essence of you being such a just humble, curious person to coming in and not coming in as the expert with all the answers. And I think that's a challenge for any consultant. If they're coming in as I have the answer and I'm the expert, that doesn't usually work out so well, particularly in a transformation, as you know, where it's really needs to be leader led and embodied by the spirit of the people who are there.
Exactly. And I admit, in my early days of my consulting career, I tried to be the expert.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
And it was quicksand, because they start asking questions you can't answer. And
no, you don't know the work.
You set yourself up as the expert. It's a trap. And I remember as I went to different industries, from construction, banking, everything, I was always asked, what do you know about, fill in the blank? What do you know about construction? And I'd say nothing, but I don't charge extra. And they're like, what? Because the more I know about you, the more I'm bought into the same stuff that's got you here in the first place. So I'm just going to come at this, learn and ask questions. And in the process, I think you're going to learn too. And that actually turned out to be a better approach than trying to present myself as the sensei.
Yeah, well, for sure. And as you call out in your book, you certainly don't want to call yourself the sensei either. That's exactly. the honorific. This continuum that we have to navigate between knowing when we should show up as the expert with our deep knowledge and doing some problem solving, and when we should be showing up more coach-like is something that leaders also need to navigate, because we're rewarded in our early careers for having the answer, or as independent contributors, we actually have ownership of problems. But when we move into that more people development role, either as a internal or external coach or consultant, or in a management leadership role, our responsibility is different. And that's a hard shift, I think, for not just consultants to make, but also senior leaders too. And that's how we make that shift from that command and control to more of this coaching environment.
Yeah, it's not binary either. I mean,
no, it's not. You have to move between it.
Yeah, that's the thing. You're balancing all the time.
Yeah.
But the more you know, I think, about a subject, there's two things. One is the more dangerous you get. And the other part of it is you should be able to frame better questions from your experience to guide the person to come into the conclusion on their own through the questions that you ask. And if you know a lot about subject matter, it doesn't hurt that. It's just instead of telling, I prefer asking.
Yes, absolutely. It's so interesting. Sometimes when I'm working with people, they say, well, don't you need to know a lot about a certain industry, as you said, and they have these aha moments that actually, or, know some about someone's problem. They have aha moments. It's almost easier to stay in that genuine curiosity when you don't know much, but when you have structure to help people to go through a problem solving process. So I always like to think that as, coaches and consultants, we own the structures for the learning, the structures for the thinking process. And it's the responsibility of the people, regardless of what problem they're coming forward or what industry, to do the thinking. Yeah.
I found Kata to be very helpful in that regard.
Yeah.
But just grooving that notion of those key questions, it almost universally applicable.
Yeah. Well, it's the essence. Mike Rother really distilled down the essence of how leaders show up as coaches at Toyota. And as I'm sure, just like Isao Yoshino has the subject of my book, you have ingrained this in your practice as well. I want to switch topics back to your book too, about what is one thing that you have discovered or learned through the process of writing and publishing your book?
um, that I knew nothing.
I hear you.
I mean, it was a very humbling experience because I always had in my head that someday I'm going to write a book. But when I actually sat down to do it, and I actually had a publisher with expectations, and I had to write it in such a way that the publisher would want to publish the book in the first place, I learned that having some content knowledge is only half the equation. There's a whole lot of other things involved in it, which to me, it was an adventure, just learning it and discovering it. And my next book hopefully will be a lot easier as a result of it. But as far as the content goes, I would think about some of the stories that I shared in the book. And then I thought about how did it change me? What did I learn from that experience, from that story that I shared? And then I think that helped me finish the book by going through more. I would think about a story that I remembered that would help reinforce the point I wanted to make. But then I would stop and think not only about the experience I've just written, but what did I learn from it? Sort of learning from my own storytelling. That part was fun. Even if they didn't publish the book, I learned a lot about myself as a process during the process.
It sounds like it was a process of deep pensée and self-reflection as well. I love that you have so many stories in the book. I think it makes it really engaging to read, and the reflections that you have. I mean, those are the nuggets of wisdom as well. So if you think back of all the stories and all the lessons you've learned through your career, what's one thing that you found was the most impactful, or it was impactful for you in changing your own behavior, or something that you learned how to do?
Well, there's so many of them. I would say the pattern would be I learned the most after failures. And when I was challenged by my internal coaches at Toyota to break down the logic in what I was doing and how I was doing it, I'll share this. I remember I had my boss, one of the VPs there, when I was early on in my career, he came by my office and he looked startled that I was in my office. And I said, he said, "What are you doing here?" I said, "I'm working." He says, "Is this where your work is done?" I go, "Well, yeah, computer, chair, desk, keyboard." And he said, "Is this the value you create?" And he walked away. And I go, "Well, that was weird." That's just sort of a drive-by. And so later we went back to him and I go, "You're really messing with my head here." And then he started to nudge me into this notion that your job doesn't consist of sitting and staring at a computer. Get out there, go to the demo, understand what's happening, talk to people, ask questions, and so that was a really profound learning to me, just how I defined working, how I defined my role was 180 different as my exposure after my exposure at Toyota than it was before.
Yeah. Wow. That's a great story and example. And I'm so thrilled. Well, I can't wait for you to read my book, Learning to Lead, Leading to Learn. I feel like there's so much overlap in your experience and Isao Yoshino's experience. And, we talked at the beginning as well that you overlapped in Torrance and you've been in some meetings together. So I'll be looking forward to hearing your reflections about his stories too. And I want to share your stories with him because I think he would really value that as well.
I would love that.
So one last question that I always lead with, what is one question that you haven't been asked about the book, either by me here or in general, and that you'd like to pose here and answer?
I think it gets back to the opening comments about why did I do it? the one thing I think it affirmed for me, or reaffirmed for me, is that people do hunger for simplicity. They would rather be led than managed. I think I want to go back. You'll appreciate this actually, because the point at which this all began was sitting in one of the physician's offices, who was a person that I was coaching. And it was a routine visit, leadership coaching session. And on his wall, on a corkboard, he had a bunch of images that I had sketched out for him over the prior sessions. And I asked him, I said, I'm flattered that you have these here. He says, I love these, and I reproduce them and I share them with other people exactly the way you drew them for me. And he said, you know what, Ken, you should staple these things together and call it a book. And I go, ha, ha, how silly is that? But it stayed in my head rattling around. And I thought, and I said, what is it about that you find useful? He said, the simplicity of it. And my ability to recreate it is not based on any artistic ability or anything like that. It's just taking a fairly complex subject and reducing it to something small. Mm-hmm. And so that really reinforced to me that if you're talking about a physician who, very highly thought physician leader who benefited from this simple little crude napkin drawings, then maybe there's something to this. So that's where it started.
That's great. I love that. And also it's a little bit like the genesis of my book too, where I had been writing some blog posts for years, and Mr. Yoshino said, well, why don't we create a booklet? And of course, staple them together kind of as you have just shared. And we both know that writing a book is much more complex, and both of these projects, I'm sure, grew much more than stapling your images together, as did writing mine. But I highly recommend your book. I loved it. Your voice and your stories and your wisdom come through, and you achieved your goal of making it simple and enjoyable to read. So I encourage everyone who's listening to get a copy of Ken's book, Lean Leadership on a Napkin: Executive's Guide to Lean Transformation in 3 Proven Steps. And of course, if you haven't already read my book too, Learning to Lead, Leading to Learn, Ken, I'll be sending you a signed copy of my book in gratitude for all of your support and mentorship and partnership through our relationship over the last decade as well.
Thank you. Well, and I have a couple to give away too. So
yes, that's right. So for those of you who are listening, we will be giving away, or Ken's giving away, 3 signed copies of his book. So follow the links to register for that. And Ken, what are other ways that people can get in touch with you if they're curious to learn more?
Oh, they can, I'm an open book. People can reach out to me at my email, ken.pilone@gmail.com. Yeah. The simplest way. Okay. And I'm always happy to respond. I love hearing from people. I love hearing what their reactions are. I love hearing suggestions for improvement and ideas for the subsequent books. So I'd love to engage more people in this conversation.
Okay, great. And speaking of more books, you alluded to more books at the end of this. So what's the plan for that?
Well, I owe my publisher 2 more books on the 2nd and 3rd steps, proven steps.
Yes.
It was suggested to me by the publisher that I just start with the 1 and tease the 2nd and 3rd. Yeah. So that's what I tried to do. But yeah, so I need to work on the integration as the next book, and then the final book will be around internalization.
Okay, great. Well, I can't wait to read those books and to continue to learn from and with you, Ken. So thank you for being here today again. Thanks everyone for listening. Again, my guest was Ken Pilone, my colleague and friend, and talking about his book, Lean Leadership on a Napkin. So thanks everyone. And if you're listening at the time this comes out, don't forget to register for the book giveaway as well. Thanks, Ken.
You bet. It was a pleasure.
Bye. Oh, and sorry, I forgot to mention everyone too. Be sure to subscribe on my YouTube channel too for future author interviews, and sign up for my newsletter to hear about always the next posts and things that are going on. So kbjanderson.com. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye. Let me